Modern scientific studies support the fact that a meditation practice can both lower your general stress level and also lower your feelings of depression. I saw two very interesting studies recently that I'd really like to share with you. One deals with lowering depression and feelings of depression, and the other one with lowering your general stress level. Now, first I'd like to note, when we talk about the modern science applied to meditation, the body of research is still relatively small. It's growing very quickly, but people didn't start studying meditative practices and the way they can impact our health until fairly recently. So the scientific backing is not large, and you'll hear that when I talk about these studies. All of that said, while it's not large, it's growing rapidly and it's very, very promising. And you'll hear that also in the results of these studies. The first one I'd like to talk about is the study that deals with depression. Now, first of all, I'd like you to think, okay, what happens when someone has depression? Well, normally, first you'd have to realize, hold on, my depression is different than other people's general depression. And so since my depression is unique and different, I should seek professional help. Then people go to seek professional help, and you end up in generally one of two places. Either you end up with a really quality psychologist and you go to them weekly or more often, and you have these sessions where they help you deal with your feelings of depression and hopefully give you some practices that you can do outside of those sessions. Or you end up getting medication from these people. Now, the medication is a really interesting solution. It can be very helpful for many people, but also many people are very skeptical of wanting to take medication for their depression, and you're on that medication forever. You have some sort of chemical imbalance in your brain that drives depression, or maybe it's addiction to technology, or just modern life in general. But either way, in order to treat your depression, if you're relying on antidepressants, you can't stop taking the antidepressants. And many people are skeptical about that. The first study I want to talk about is a multiple site study that was led by a professor who is at Exeter University, and over the course of the study, he actually ended up moving to the Department of Psychiatry at Oxford University. The study followed 424 different participants over the course of 2 years, and all of these people were already receiving treatment for depression. In fact, all of these people were already being medicated for their depression. Over the course of these 2 years, these 424 participants were split into two groups. One of the groups simply continued with their antidepressants, and they took the medication and did the treatments, and they had like the expected results that, like, this is a group that is the control group, and it's been studied historically. We know the effect of antidepressants, and they can be helpful for many people. The other group continued with their antidepressants, but also they were given MBCT, or mindfulness-based cognitive behavior therapy. Now, cognitive behavior therapy is somewhat of an old school now of psychiatry, but it really comes from the roots of Stoic philosophy. So I have a particular passion for this form of psychiatry because I just absolutely love the Stoic philosophers. So the underlying idea of cognitive behavioral therapy is realizing where you have agency in life and where you don't have agency in life. And when you don't have agency, you simply have to accept the results. In fact, the Stoic philosophers would say you have to love the results because there is no other option. You have no agency. And so cognitive behavioral therapy begins with this basis, and it extends into some psychological practices that people can use in order to help people just develop more worth and agency in their lives. But MBCT takes the additional step to its cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's also combined with mindfulness practices. These mindfulness practices are literally just meditation practices where you pay attention to the thoughts going through your head. And so you're mindful, paying attention to the mind. So this is how the study went. The group is split into two groups, and then some people are given MBCT and some people are told to just continue with their meds. Both groups have medications, and both groups have the option to continue with medications. So the first interesting effect is the vast majority of people in the antidepressant group just continued with their antidepressants, which makes sense. This is the solution they've been given. It's relatively useful for them. They continue using it, but the cost is they have to continue using these antidepressants over the long term. The MBCT group, on large, actually stopped using their antidepressants, although many participants did continue using their antidepressants. So I'd just say that group was split, but the vast majority of the group actually stopped taking the meds. And then in the end, when the effect size is measured as to how well did these different groups do, the result is actually exactly the same. Now, when I say exactly the same, I mean they're not measurably different. So it's not that every metric was the exact same, but it does mean that the statistics that came out in the end were saying there's no provable difference between these two remedies to depression, which is interesting. One thing I would like to be clear about is that if you're experiencing depression, go see a professional. I'm not a professional, I can't help you with this. But according to the science, if you're given antidepressants, they can be very effective in helping you treat your depression. However, so can meditation practices if you'll do them on the regular. The difference is that you do have to be invested in continuing with your meditation practices and with cognitive behavioral therapy. The one caveat I'll give is there actually were interesting partitions of these groups where meditation practices outperformed the medications, and that's fascinating. So what the study seems to support is that if you struggle with depression, antidepressants can be very useful. But a regular meditation practice combined with cognitive behavioral therapy can be equally effective, and you don't need medications for it. It's simply something to consider. The second fascinating study I saw deals with the amount of stress we deal with on our daily lives. Now, this is a smaller study, and it came out of Stanford. And the first thing I'd like to say about stress is it often gets a bad rap in our modern day. We hear of the hormone cortisol, and we think bad. And that's often fair, but the fact is that stress serves a very important part of our lives. If we see some sort of danger, we need that stress response to react to it. So there are times when we should have stress in our lives, where we should undergo an intense workout, where we should interact with stress in useful ways. The problem is the general underlying low level of stress that we experience all the time throughout our lives. And this happens more often in the modern day because when there's nothing stressful going on, one of the common things we do is pick up our phone, and now we have bad news, and now we have video games, and now we have low levels of stress going on. That stress could be entertaining. It's still stress, and it still has costs in our physiology. And so this study seems to support that meditation can help us lower our stress. And in fact, the body of growing evidence seems to be very supportive of the fact that meditation can help us with stress. So this study is fascinating. They split 114 participants into 4 groups. Of these 4 groups, one of them was given mindfulness meditation practices in order to try to lower their stress, and they measured the effect based on surveys. All 3 of the other groups were given breathing practices to go through, and so they're not really doing mindfulness meditation, they're simply undergoing breathing practices. But they were given different breathing practices, which is why there are 3 other groups. The first group was given hyperventilative breathing practices, so this means they're taking in more oxygen than they're releasing. Their inhales are longer than their exhales. And then the second group was given box breathing. Box breathing is where you inhale for a certain count, you hold at the top for a certain count, you exhale for a certain count, and at the bottom for a certain count. And it's a box because these counts are the same. So you're inhaling and retaining for the exact same amount of time that you are exhaling and at the bottom of the breath. And that was the second of the breathing practice groups, was given box breathing, so it just balances the inhale and the exhale. And then the third group was given what they call physiological sighs in order to practice and lower their stress. Now, physiological sigh is just a shorter inhale and then a long sighing exhale. And so we have these 4 groups that are enacting these practices on the daily in order to try to lower their stress level. And the first thing that's worth noting is that over 90% of all participants reported positive effects on their stress level. So the first thing I would just note is that whichever of these practices you enjoy, they all can be very, very useful in lowering your stress level. But there was one that clearly stood out above the rest. And it's fascinating, but it makes perfect sense. It's the physiological sigh. And so I think this makes total sense when we consider the anatomy of the lungs. So there are different nerves in different places in your lungs, and they connect directly to different systems. Most importantly, I'm thinking of either the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the stress response, and the parasympathetic is the deep relaxation, rest and digest systems of the body. So you can probably actually feel this when you breathe. When you breathe really high into the lungs, you start to feel more stress level. It's because the nerves in the high end of the lungs connect more directly with the SNS. So if you breathe really high in the lungs, short and fast, like then you're breathing way up high, you can feel it in your chest, and you get stressed. Many people live their lives this way, and if you have trouble breathing super deep into the low level of the lungs, breathing into the belly, my trick would be pretend like you have a straw and then breathe through the straw. And you immediately fill up your belly. You breathe really deep into the lungs. And the deeper the air goes into the lungs, the more you're hitting nerve endings that connect with the PNS, the parasympathetic, the rest and digest systems. So this physiological sigh really goes deep into the lungs, and it connects more directly with the parasympathetic nervous system, thus lowering our stress response. It seems to make total sense, and that is the result of the study. So overall, I would say you want to lower your stress. All of these are useful things. Do some breathing practices, do some meditation of any sort. But if your specific goal is lowering your stress, then there's one of these that is more effective than the rest. And on the daily, practice the physiological sigh. I've heard some people talk about it as like a double inhale and a long exhale. So you go, and that's a physiological sigh. If this is interesting, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button. And if you'd like to see a meditation directly related to deep rest, I got one coming up on the end screen. This is the Stoic Yogi, out.